Marcus Harper's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. The red and blue lights fractured across his windshield, slashing the night in jagged shards. He had done nothing wrong. He had followed every traffic law, every signal, every rule. Yet here he was, pulled from his car on a deserted stretch of Main Street, the officer's boot pressing into his chest before a word of explanation. License and registration. Now. The command cut through the cold air, sharp and unyielding. Marcus's pulse thundered, his ears ringing with the screech of tires and the faint murmur of distant city traffic. Around him, shadows danced as if mocking him. He saw the officer's badge glinting in the streetlight, but it was not a symbol of protection. It was a weapon pointed at him. He tried to speak, but his voice caught, choked by disbelief. The officer's eyes were hard, unreadable. A hand gripped his shoulder and shoved him to the hood of his own car. "You think you can drive through this city without being seen?" The words were a blade. Pain and humiliation fused into a single, hot pulse. Marcus felt every second stretch into eternity as the officer's partner filmed, smirking. And then a sudden flash of recognition froze him. An emblem on the officer's uniform. Something he hadn't noticed before. The insignia of a military diplomat liaison. Marcus's chest tightened. The man abusing his power was not just a cop. He was untouchable. The night swallowed his fear, leaving only the faint click of a recording camera and the officer's looming shadow. Marcus didn't know whether he would live to see justice, or whether justice would ever see him. The streetlight flickered as Marcus Harper eased his car to stop. The faint hum of the city at night seemed distant, almost irrelevant. Then, the sudden flare of red and blue cut through the darkness. He exhaled sharply. Another routine traffic stop. Or so he hoped. The officer emerged, boots clicking against asphalt, a badge catching the sparse light. License and registration. The voice barked, clipped and impatient. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wallet. "Evening, officer," he said, trying to steady the tone in his voice. "Did I—" "Step out of the car. Now." The command was sharp, leaving no room for negotiation. Marcus obeyed, the chill of night seeping through his jacket. He was pushed against the hood. The metal bit into his palms, cold and unforgiving. Around him, the officer's partner aimed a phone camera, capturing every second. "Do you think you can drive through this city without being seen?" The officer sneered. The words were not a question. They were an accusation, a statement of power. Marcus's pulse pounded. I didn't do anything," he stammered, voice breaking. "I haven't broken any law." The officer's grip tightened on his shoulder. "Doesn't matter what you think." Each second expanded, elongated by fear and disbelief. Marcus tried to process the absurdity, the humiliation. His mind raced through news stories, warnings, every tale of abuse and bias he had heard. Then Marcus's gaze caught a small emblem on the officer's chest. An insignia he had seen before in formal contexts, never in a street confrontation. Military, diplomatic, untouchable. His stomach dropped. The officer's partner chuckled behind the camera. Marcus's own reflection in the car window was distorted, fragmented. Every flash of light from the police vehicle made him feel smaller, exposed. He felt anger surge, but it was a quiet, burning anger laced with fear. His mouth opened, then closed. What could he say to someone with institutional immunity? Someone whose connections meant he could act without consequences? The officer leaned closer. "You'll learn soon enough." The words settled over him like a shadow. Marcus's chest tightened. The recording phone hummed quietly, the only witness in the empty street. The night was silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the officer's looming presence. Marcus's eyes met the emblem again. Recognition and dread collided. He wanted to run, to fight, to disappear, but the weight of authority pressed him down. He felt the street tilt, his future uncertain. The emblem gleamed, a reminder that this was bigger than him. He could not predict what would come next, only that the night was far from over. The camera clicked. The red and blue lights pulsed. And Marcus Harper realized that justice, if it came at all, would demand more than courage. It would demand the reckoning of the untouchable. Word count 950. The next morning, Marcus Harper woke to a barrage of notifications on his phone. Screenshots of the arrest were everywhere, some sympathetic, many not. Comments ranged from outrage to subtle victim blaming. He must have done something wrong. One read, "Typical." Another sneered. Each swipe dug a little deeper into his chest, making him question reality itself. His mother's voice over FaceTime tried to soothe him. "Baby, you know you did nothing wrong. Don't let them twist your truth." "I know, Mom," Marcus said, though he didn't feel the reassurance she intended. His own reflection in the black screen of the laptop felt foreign, fractured by the flashing images of him on the hood, hands splayed, expression tense with fear and anger. By mid-morning, local news outlets had picked up the footage. A reporter's voice droned over clips. A man was detained last night in a traffic stop. Questions remained about the officer's conduct. The words were measured, but the images told another story. Marcus could see the subtle code in the phrasing, the unspoken doubt cast on him. At work, colleagues avoided his eyes. The small nods or forced smiles felt like silent judgments. One coworker whispered, "Be careful who you talk to. You don't want trouble." Marcus clenched his fists onto the desk. Trouble, as if being beaten and humiliated in public was something he could somehow prevent by silence. He stepped out for lunch, and the city felt different. The air smelled harsher. People moved faster. A man on the sidewalk muttered under his breath. Staring at him, Marcus turned sharply, seeing only the blur of a passerby. But the feeling lingered. Eyes were on him, and not with sympathy. Back at home, he scrolled through social media. The video had gone viral. Comments alternated between support and thinly veiled attacks. "Maybe he shouldn't have resisted," one said. "Black man in trouble again," another typed. Marcus felt bile rise, and the tight knot of anger and fear coiled further in his stomach. That evening, he joined a video call with a close friend, Jamal. "They're trying to make it seem like it's your fault," Jamal said, face taut with concern. "You need evidence, witnesses. You can't fight blind." "I have the recording," Marcus said, voice quiet, "but it's just me and a phone. Everyone else sees the officer's badge and assumes authority. That's what terrifies me. Not just what he did, but who he is." Jamal's jaw clenched. "We'll make them see. People can't look away forever." The news ticker updated again. The same clip, different angles, different voices. Marcus felt the walls close in. He wanted to vanish into the city streets, to disappear from cameras, from scrutiny, from judgment. But the memory of the officer's glare, the emblem on his chest, stayed fixed in his mind. He sat in his apartment, the hum of the fridge a weak anchor against the storm outside. His phone buzzed again, an alert from a local advocacy group. They wanted to contact him, offer help, perhaps legal assistance. Marcus stared at the screen, hesitated, then pressed accept. A faint hope flickered, tempered by fear. Each new contact, each new comment, was a reminder that the night's injustice had not ended. It had only expanded, filling the city, infecting conversations, twisting public perception. And yet, Marcus Harper understood one truth clearly. The emblem on the officer's chest was not just a symbol, it was a challenge. To confront it meant exposing the untouchable, revealing the hidden power structures that allowed abuse to thrive. He leaned back, staring at the muted TV showing looping footage of the street where it happened. His hands trembled slightly, but there was determination there too. The city watched, yes, but now Marcus Harper resolved to watch back. Carefully, deliberately, waiting for the moment when the scales of power could finally shift. Marcus Harper entered the precinct with a mix of determination and apprehension. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, sterile and unwelcoming. The linoleum floor reflected the rigid lines of the room, a grid that seemed to mirror the cold, bureaucratic machinery of the system itself. He approached the front desk, offering a polite nod. "I'd like to file a formal complaint regarding Officer Davis," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with tight hair and a neutral expression, raised an eyebrow. "Forms are online. Do you have the case number?" No, I don't," Marcus admitted. "But I was detained last night on Main Street. I have a video recording of the incident." She tapped at her keyboard, eyes flicking to the screen without meeting his. We handle complaints in the order they are received. Videos can be submitted, but they don't guarantee action. You understand that? Yes, I understand, Marcus said, though his stomach tightened. He felt the first pulse of frustration, a reminder that the law itself often moved at a deliberate, indifferent pace. The clerk sighed. You'll need to fill out this form, and then it goes to internal affairs. Depending on workload, it could take weeks to months before anyone contacts you. And sometimes, complaints are dismissed if the officer is deemed credible or if there's no corroborating evidence. Marcus's hands clenched into fists at his sides. But there's a recording. It shows the entire encounter. She shrugged, typing rapidly. It still may not be enough. Internal Affairs has discretion. He left the desk and sat in a waiting area, the sterile walls closing in. Across from him, another man waited, staring blankly at the floor, head bowed. They shared no words. Yet Marcus sensed the same dread, the same knowledge that the system could be indifferent to the harm inflicted. When a detective finally called his name, Marcus followed him down a narrow corridor. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and distort. The detective's voice was low, professional, and careful. Mr. Harper, I've reviewed the complaint preliminarily. The officer involved is in good standing. He has prior commendations and no recorded complaints. Marcus swallowed hard. You mean my word and the recording don't count against someone in good standing? It means we evaluate context. Officers are granted discretion in the field. If no formal misconduct is established, the complaint may not proceed. He felt a surge of helplessness. So someone with authority can violate my rights, humiliate me, and walk away unpunished because they've been good before? The detective shifted uncomfortably. The law recognizes patterns, Mr. Harper. But a single incident may not meet the threshold for formal action. That doesn't mean your experience isn't valid. Marcus's chest tightened. Valid doesn't stop someone from leaving me on the street, bleeding, shivering, and afraid to drive at night. The detective remained silent for a moment, a subtle acknowledgement of truth that did little to ease the weight pressing on Marcus. He returned to the waiting room, the walls now seeming to lean inward, as if the building itself were complicit in minimizing his suffering. Later, he sat with his lawyer, a sharp, efficient woman named Elaine Carter. The system protects itself first, she said plainly. Internal affairs exist to maintain order, not to meet justice to the powerless. Your recording helps, but you'll need witnesses, documentation, corroboration. And even then, the officer's connections, diplomatic, military, complicate matters. Marcus ran a hand over his face. Connections, that insignia on his chest. I didn't even know what it meant at the time. Now I realize it makes him untouchable. Elaine nodded grimly. Untouchable, but not invisible. You have evidence, community attention, and your own voice. Those are tools you can use strategically. Later, at home, Marcus replayed the video again. Each frame was vivid, the officer's aggression unflinching, the partner filming with amusement. He paused at the emblem on the uniform, the symbol of privilege and power he had overlooked in the heat of the moment. The phone rang. Another call from the advocacy group. Marcus, we've connected with legal experts and journalists. They want to review the footage. They're interested in systemic patterns, not just one incident. Are you willing to cooperate? He hesitated. Exposure was risky. Retaliation was possible. Yet he realized silence was the greater danger. Yes, he said. Do it. That evening, Marcus spoke with Jamal again. It's like the system is a fortress, he said, voice tight. Walls, procedures, forms, all designed to protect them, not people like us. Jamal's tone was measured, resolute. Fortresses can fall, Marcus. Every wall has a crack. You're finding theirs. Marcus leaned back, exhaustion heavy in his limbs. The legal forms, the bureaucratic indifference, the implicit warnings, each was a test of endurance. He understood now that confronting the officer would require more than outrage. It would demand strategy, patience, and the ability to withstand the institutional weight pressing down on him. Night fell, and the city's lights flickered against the dark sky. Marcus stared out the window at the streets, he had once traversed without fear. Now, each corner, each flashing sign of authority, felt loaded with tension. He made a silent vow. He would not let the system's inertia or the officer's connections erase his experience. The first small victories would not be dramatic, just forms submitted, calls answered, voices recorded, but they were essential. He would gather evidence, build support, and document every abuse of power he encountered. In the quiet of his apartment, Marcus felt the weight of reality settle over him. The system was a labyrinth. Corruption and privilege were entrenched. But somewhere within that maze lay accountability. Somewhere the untouchable could be exposed. And Marcus Harper, though battered and weary, resolved to navigate all. Marcus Harper couldn't sleep. The officer's face, cold and impassive, haunted him. He stared at the ceiling of his apartment, replaying every detail. The shove against the hood, the sharp words, the emblem glinting under the streetlight. But now, another realization gnawed at him. He was alone in this fight. The next morning, Elaine called with news. Marcus, I dug into Officer Davis's past. There are whispers, incidents quietly dismissed, complaints archived without action. No one spoke openly. It's as if his reputation shields him from scrutiny. Marcus exhaled sharply, the weight of betrayal settling like stone in his chest. So the system not only protects him, it erases those he hurts? Yes, Elaine said flatly. And most colleagues and witnesses stay silent out of fear or complicity. You're not just confronting an officer, you're confronting a network built to protect him. Later, Marcus met Jamal at a small cafe. Jamal leaned forward, voice low. People are scared. Your co-workers, neighbors, even friends. They don't want trouble. They whisper, they avoid, but no one steps up. You have to decide, are you willing to carry that weight alone? I don't have a choice, Marcus replied. If I stay silent, it's like I'm consenting to the injustice. The first public hearings were scheduled, but they were behind closed doors. Marcus discovered that many prior complaints against Davis had vanished without trace. Emails to supervisors went unanswered. Internal memos suggested procedural errors, yet none led to real accountability. One afternoon, a colleague approached him hesitantly. Marcus, people are talking. Some say you're stirring up trouble. Be careful. They know who you are now. Marcus's stomach nodded. The city felt smaller, every street corner laden with judgment, suspicion, and fear. His professional reputation, carefully built over years, seemed fragile under the glare of someone else's power. He returned home and began cataloging every detail. Times, dates, names, snippets of conversations. Each entry reinforced a pattern. The subtle dismissals, the coded language, the invisible walls protecting the officer. A knock at the door startled him. It was a journalist he had connected with through the advocacy group. Marcus, I want to tell your story, she said, voice steady. But I need all the details, every document, every recording. This isn't just about one man. It's about exposing systemic failure. He nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility. I've got it, he said. Everything I've documented, every interaction, you can see it all. The journalist's eyes were sharp. Good. We'll be careful, but the public needs to know. They need to see what happens when power shields itself. That night, Marcus reviewed the video again. The emblem on Davis's chest gleamed in the streetlight, a reminder of the authority and connections protecting him. He felt anger, fear, and the bitter taste of betrayal. The city, the system, even those around him, none had acted to stop the abuse. He thought of his own father, a man who had taught him the value of integrity, and how often integrity meant indifference or hostility in the real world. Marcus felt a surge of determination. Betrayal was inevitable when challenging entrenched power, but it would not break him. In the following days, Marcus faced subtle attacks. Anonymous calls, passive-aggressive messages from coworkers, veiled threats in public forums. Each one tested his resolve, but also sharpened his awareness. He learned to anticipate, to prepare, to document. During a scheduled meeting with the Internal Affairs liaison, Marcus pressed questions. Why were prior complaints dismissed? He asked, voice firm. The liaison's reply was measured, careful. Procedures were followed. There's no evidence to suggest misconduct. Marcus's jaw tightened. The evidence exists. Videos, witnesses. What you call procedures protect him, not justice. Silence stretched across the office. The weight of institutional protection was palpable. Marcus left, realizing that confrontation alone would not suffice. Exposure required strategy, allies, and public awareness. By midweek, he had briefed the journalist, coordinated with the advocacy group, and shared his documentation with his lawyer. He realized the fight was not just against one officer. It was against an invisible framework of complicity, fear, and privilege. That evening, Marcus walked through the city streets. The night was alive with distant sirens, the hum of traffic, and the subtle eyes of those who observed him silently. Each shadow felt loaded with judgment, caution, or indifference. Yet within him, a quiet determination burned. The betrayal he faced was profound. Friends whispered, the system obstructed, and the officer remained untouchable in public view. But Marcus Harper understood the pattern now, the method behind the silence and dismissal. He would not be deterred. He returned to his apartment, cataloging the last of his records and emails. He knew the next step required a public reckoning, exposure that could pierce the veil of protection around Davis. But he also knew it would come at a cost, the emotional toll, the personal risk, the isolation. Yet he resolved that the cost was necessary. Betrayal was a shadow he would walk through, not a wall to turn him back. The city had watched the abuse unfold. Now, Marcus Harper prepared to make the shadow speak, to reveal the architecture of power that had allowed injustice to thrive. Marcus Harper stared at the documents Elaine spread across the kitchen table. Each file revealed layers of the officer's dual identity. Military records, diplomatic postings, internal commendations. The emblem on his chest was more than decoration. It was a shield. He's not just a cop, Elaine said, tapping a folder. He's a military diplomat liaison. That means legal protections, immunity in certain situations, and a network of influence that extends far beyond the precinct. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he absorbed the implications. So everything he does on the street he can get away with? Elaine shook her head. Not everything, but much. He operates in a gray zone where power and privilege intersect. That's why Internal Affairs was so dismissive. They know the consequences of challenging him. The realization left Marcus feeling simultaneously small and exposed. He had confronted one man, but the man's mask concealed a web of authority that spanned institutions. Later, Marcus met with a journalist, Lila Moreno, in a small downtown cafe. Lila's laptop glowed with tabs of research, prior incidents, news articles, diplomatic communications. "This is bigger than a street stop," she said, voice steady. "He's untouchable in the ordinary sense. But that doesn't mean invisible. We expose patterns, show abuse, and pressure institutions. That's how untouchable people fall." Marcus nodded, the weight of strategy pressing on him. "We need to be careful. One misstep, and the shield protects him while I'm left vulnerable." They spent hours planning. Lila suggested publicizing systemic connections without attacking personal life, focusing on policy violations, abuse of power, and the emblematic role of privilege. Every conversation, every meeting was cautious, deliberate. The risk of retaliation was real. That night, Marcus revisited the street where it had happened. The flashing red and blue lights were gone, replaced by ordinary darkness. He traced the memory of the shove, the officer's words, the emblem catching light. The city was quiet, almost indifferent. But Marcus felt the weight of the mask, the diplomat's veneer hiding unchecked authority. He imagined the corridors of power where the officer moved freely, away from the scrutiny of citizens. That mask was a barrier, a shield, a weapon. The next morning, he met with community leaders. Dialogue was tense, layered with politeness masking fear. "People are afraid to speak," one said. "He's well connected. They worry about their jobs, their families, exposure." Marcus responded firmly. "Fear shouldn't protect abuse. If we remain silent, the mask becomes permanent. The city sees nothing, but the damage persists." They discussed avenues for legal intervention, media strategy, and public awareness. Each suggestion balanced risk with potential impact. Every move had to account for the officer's dual role. Later, Elaine called. Marcus, the internal affairs liaison may try to delay any investigation, but your documentation, plus media attention, gives leverage. Timing is key. Exposure needs a clear narrative, credible evidence, and allies willing to stand publicly. Marcus felt the enormity of the challenge. He had entered the system as an individual seeking justice. Now, he was part of a broader strategy against systemic concealment. The fight was no longer just personal. It was emblematic, symbolic. At home, he reviewed the footage again. The officer's posture, the shove, the partner filming, all framed within the glow of the streetlight. The emblem gleamed, a constant reminder of untouchable authority. Marcus realized that to challenge it, he would need persistence, precision, and an unwavering moral focus. By evening, he received another call from the advocacy group. We've connected with legal experts and human rights organizations. They want a detailed report. Marcus realized the exposure was spreading. The mask could be pierced, but only if he moved deliberately, carefully, without emotional missteps that could be exploited. He lay awake that night, reflecting on betrayal, systemic protection, and the hidden network shielding abuse. The mask wasn't just symbolic. It represented the complicity of institutions, the silence of bystanders, and the layered authority that allowed one man to harm without immediate consequence. But Marcus also understood that masks, no matter how rigid, can be lifted. Exposure, persistence, and documentation could strip it away. The Diplomat's facade was a challenge, but one Marcus Harper was now equipped to confront. He resolved that the next moves would be public, precise, and unavoidable. The mask could shield the officer in ordinary situations, but it could not shield him from truth revealed strategically, methodically, and publicly. The city slept, unaware of the slow, careful unmasking underway. Marcus Harper, despite fear and exhaustion, felt a controlled determination. The first steps of accountability had begun. Marcus Harper stood on the steps of the community center, the evening sky stretching dark and heavy above him. A small group had gathered, local activists, friends, and a few journalists. Their faces were tense, wary, but determined. Marcus could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him, heavier than any fear the officer had inspired. Tonight is about making our voices heard, he began, voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. Not just about me, but about everyone who's been silenced by the system. A journalist raised a camera, capturing the moment. Each flash of light reminded Marcus that exposure was both his ally and a risk. The officer, somewhere in the city, could retaliate if provoked. The balance was delicate. Conversations erupted in small groups. Marcus listened more than he spoke, noting the subtle shifts in tone. Fear was everywhere, but so was anger. We've all seen it, one activist said. People with power hiding behind badges, titles, connections. This isn't just one incident, it's a pattern. Marcus shared the video footage, carefully edited for public viewing. The room's atmosphere shifted. Murmurs of shock and dismay replaced initial caution. It's not just an isolated case, he said. It's systemic, and the only way to confront it is together. At home later, he coordinated with Lila Moreno and Elaine Carter. Every phone call, email, and message was a tactical step. Timing media releases, preparing public statements, and ensuring legal safeguards required meticulous attention. One misstep could be exploited by the officer's network. Meanwhile, internal resistance began to appear. Anonymous threats arrived in emails, veiled warnings slipped into text messages, and subtle pressure from work colleagues reminded Marcus of his vulnerability. Yet each attempt to intimidate strengthened his resolve. He learned to anticipate the psychological tactics, cataloging and documenting every interaction. A meeting with community leaders turned tense when one elder said, "You're asking too much from people. They fear retaliation. You could be isolated, Marcus. They'll stay silent if it's safer." "I understand the risk," Marcus replied, voice firm. "But silence allows abuse to continue. Courage doesn't mean absence of fear. It means acting despite it." The first public hearing was scheduled. Marcus prepared, rehearsing dialogue, anticipating questions, and strategizing responses. He knew the officer would arrive with a team of lawyers and diplomats, poised behind a shield of institutional protection. The room would be a theater of power dynamics, and Marcus needed to command presence without arrogance. On the day of a hearing, tension was palpable. Marcus's lawyer guided him through the protocols, while journalists set up cameras. The officer entered, demeanor controlled, mask of civility in place. The Diplomat insignia caught the light, as though to remind everyone of the authority he wielded. Marcus presented his evidence, piece by piece, video footage, witness statements, patterns of prior complaints. Each point was measured, precise, and undeniable. Dialogue between him, the officer, and legal representatives crackled with tension. "Your behavior that night was aggressive," Marcus said, voice calm but unwavering. "And the evidence shows that authority was used to intimidate, humiliate, and abuse." The officer responded smoothly, dismissing the claims, yet the cracks were visible. Micro-expressions betrayed impatience and frustration. He tried to control the narrative, but Marcus's documentation, corroboration, and public attention countered each deflection. Outside, community members watched news feeds, sharing updates and amplifying the story on social media. Marcus realized that public scrutiny was a shield. The officer could no longer rely on silence and obscurity to protect him. Later, Marcus met Jamal and a few allies. "We're making them accountable," Jamal said, voice resolute. "But the fight is far from over. They'll push back, find loopholes, and test our limits." "I know," Marcus replied, "but we've fractured the illusion of untouchability. The mask is slipping." At night, alone, Marcus reflected on the personal cost. Anxiety gnawed at him, sleep was sporadic, and the emotional strain was heavy. Yet the fractures he had created within the officer's protective network provided tangible proof that resistance, though painstaking, was effective. He reviewed the public statements, legal notes, and community plans one last time. Every sentence, every piece of evidence, was a lever. The officer's network could manipulate bureaucracies, suppress internal complaints, and intimidate individuals. But the collective, strategic effort was slowly shifting the balance. In the days that followed, small victories emerged. Internal memos leaked, corroborating Marcus's claims. Journalists published careful, factual accounts. Public forums discussed systemic abuse, and officials could no longer ignore the growing pressure. Yet the cost was clear. Marcus's personal life had narrowed, friendship strained, and the weight of responsibility pressed on him daily. Exposure required sacrifice. Courage demanded endurance. Resistance demanded unwavering focus. And still, the officer remained a formidable adversary, cloaked in connections and authority. But cracks were visible now, fractures forming in the facade that had long shielded him. Marcus understood that the struggle would not end immediately, but the balance had begun to tip. Marcus Harper walked through the city streets one evening, the hum of traffic and distant sirens a constant reminder of life continuing around him. He felt the subtle eyes of others, the tension, the anticipation. Every step was measured, aware, cautious, but also resolute. The city watched, and now he watched back, ready to press the advantage, document each act of resistance, and expose each abuse of power. The fractures were there. Resistance was growing. Marcus Harper understood that the coming days would test him, push him to limits, and demand sacrifices. But the path forward was clear. Courage, strategy, and collective action would determine the outcome. The courthouse steps were crowded, journalist cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward, capturing every face, every reaction. Marcus Harper stood among community leaders and allies, heart pounding, aware that this day carried the weight of every injustice he had endured. The officer, Davis, entered moments later, expression composed, diplomatic, insignia gleaming on his chest. Power radiated from him, but cracks in the mask were visible under the glare of public scrutiny. Inside the hearing room, the atmosphere was tense. Legal teams took their places, journalists recorded every word, and community members observed silently, yet expectantly. Marcus's pulse raced, but he drew in a steadying breath. This was the culmination of months of strategy, documentation, and resistance. The proceedings began with opening statements. Marcus's lawyer spoke clearly, presenting a timeline of events, prior complaints, and the video evidence. Each sentence emphasized patterns, not just isolated incidents, connecting abuse to systemic protection. When Marcus's turn arrived, He spoke with measured intensity. "I was subjected to humiliation, physical intimidation, and abuse of authority. Officer Davis's actions are not an isolated incident. They are enabled by a system designed to shield him and others like him from accountability." Davis responded with carefully curated politeness, denying the allegations, portraying them as misunderstandings or misinterpretations. His voice was calm, controlled, almost rehearsed, but Marcus noticed microexpressions, tightened jaw, fleeting tension around the eyes that betrayed frustration. Witnesses were called. Bystanders who had filmed or observed, colleagues who had previously feared speaking up, community leaders, all testified with courage, recounting the atmosphere of intimidation, fear, and complicity. Dialogue between witnesses and legal representatives highlighted the patterns of systemic abuse, revealing the structural protections that had allowed Davis's behavior to persist. Outside, the city followed the hearing via live streams. Social media amplified each revelation. The video that once placed Marcus in a position of vulnerability now became a tool of exposure, documenting power misused and authority unchecked. Public discourse shifted, acknowledging patterns of privilege and institutional indifference. During cross-examination, Davis's legal team attempted to undermine witnesses, question credibility, and exploit procedural loopholes. Each challenge revealed the mechanisms of power Marcus had studied for months. He and Elaine countered with documentation, evidence, and calm precision, demonstrating foresight and preparation. At one point, Marcus directly confronted Davis. "Authority is not immunity. Privilege does not excuse abuse. Your actions, protected or not, harmed a citizen and violated the public trust." Davis's eyes flickered briefly, a crack in his composed exterior. His partner's presence was tense, the earlier smirk from the street replaced by careful neutrality. The courtroom atmosphere shifted, the weight of accountability pressing visibly against the facade of control. Testimony concluded, and closing statements were delivered. Marcus observed, exhausted but resolute, as the legal team laid out a compelling case linking individual abuse to systemic complicity. The narrative was clear. Authority without oversight is dangerous, and concealment of misconduct perpetuates injustice. After hours of deliberation, the hearing panel issued preliminary findings. Davis faced formal reprimand, temporary suspension, and internal investigation. His diplomatic privileges were scrutinized, limitations imposed, and protective shield that had long insulated him from accountability began to falter. Marcus felt a complex mixture of relief and weariness. Justice, though partial and procedural, had been achieved. Yet he understood the emotional toll. Months of fear, isolation, and scrutiny had left scars that would not vanish overnight. The public reckoning had come at a cost, both personal and social. Outside the courthouse, reporters pressed questions, and Marcus spoke cautiously but firmly. "This isn't just about one man. It's about patterns of protection that allow abuse to thrive. Exposure, transparency, and collective vigilance are essential if we want a fair and just system." Community members surrounded him, offering support, affirmation, and gratitude. For the first time in months, Marcus felt a subtle release of tension, the acknowledgement that his courage and perseverance had shifted the balance, however slightly. That night, Marcus reflected on the experience. The city lights blurred through his apartment window, distant sirens punctuating the quiet. Exposure had pierced the officer's facade. The mask of untouchability was fractured, and systemic scrutiny was now active. Yet the emotional cost was clear. Anxiety, trauma, and a persistent awareness of vulnerability lingered. He spoke briefly with Jamal. "We've made progress," Marcus said, "but the system is still fragile, and the fight against abuse continues." "Yes," Jamal replied. "And now people know they can't hide behind authority forever. That's the real shift." Marcus reviewed his documentation one last time, ensuring every piece of evidence was preserved. The struggle for accountability had entered a new phase, one of ongoing vigilance and community action. The fight was far from over, but precedent had been set. In the solitude of his apartment, Marcus allowed himself a brief exhale. Justice had not been simple nor complete, but it had been real. The officer's fall was public, undeniable, and irreversible in the court of both law and public opinion. Marcus Harper had confronted a masked authority and exposed the fractures within. Yet even as victory settled, he knew the personal scars would remain. Sleep would be uneasy, trust cautious, and vigilance constant. Exposure had won against abuse, but not without cost. The city had witnessed his ordeal, and in that witnessing, a subtle, powerful shift began. Authority can no longer act without accountability when illuminated by courage, evidence, and collective observation. Marcus Harper understood that justice is not a singular moment, but a process, a slow, deliberate dismantling of protections that enable abuse. And though the battle had reached a critical turning point, the vigilance required of those confronting systemic injustice would continue indefinitely. The officer, Davis, no longer carried the same air of untouchable authority. Internal memos leaked to the press, revealing not just his misconduct, but the protective mechanisms that had allowed it to persist. His suspension was publicized, limitations imposed on his diplomatic privileges, and colleagues who had once hesitated now distanced themselves. The mask had fallen, but the damage it had caused lingered. Marcus Harper sat in his apartment, the city lights outside casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. He replayed the months of struggle, the shove against the car hood, the subtle dismissals, the threats, and the painstaking gathering of evidence. Each memory carried a weight, a scar, a lesson in resilience. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Jamal entered, carrying coffee and a quiet solidarity. "It's over, at least officially," he said, voice low. The public hearing, media coverage, legal action. It all culminated. They can't ignore it now. Marcus nodded but remained silent. Relief was tempered by exhaustion. The personal cost had been immense. Sleepless nights, strained relationships, constant anxiety. Even with victory, he could not undo the fear that had gripped him when confronted by abuse disguised as authority. Elaine Carter called later with updates. "The officer is facing further investigation for misuse of authority," she said. "His network of protection is fracturing. The public scrutiny ensures accountability this time. But Marcus, remember, the emotional toll isn't erased." Marcus exhaled, a mixture of exhaustion and acknowledgement. "I know," he replied. "I feel it every day." In the following weeks, he reconnected with friends and colleagues, though cautiously. Conversations were layered with reflection, subtle wariness, and appreciation for his perseverance. He realized that the ordeal had shifted perceptions. People now recognized patterns of abuse and the courage required to challenge them, but the emotional residue remained. Marcus also engaged with community leaders and advocacy groups. The public reckoning had sparked dialogue, legislative inquiry, and renewed scrutiny of institutional protections. Policies were being reviewed, complaint mechanisms strengthened, and training programs initiated to address abuse of authority. While the systemic battle was ongoing, Marcus understood his role in creating momentum. Yet even as the city shifted, Marcus faced private battles. Flashbacks, anxiety, and hypervigilance reminded him of vulnerability. He acknowledged that poetic justice, Davis's fall from unchallenged power, could not erase trauma. Recovery was a process, one that demanded patience, reflection, and self-compassion. One evening, Marcus visited the street where it had begun. The same stretch of asphalt, the same faded streetlights. He traced the memory of the shove, the emblem, the fear that had seemed insurmountable. Standing there, he understood the distance he had traveled, not just in terms of public exposure, but personal growth, strategy, and resilience. He spoke quietly to himself. "I survived this. I fought this, and the system can no longer ignore it." The city's hum was different now. Surveillance cameras, flashing lights, and the presence of authority no longer represented only fear. They represented accountability. Marcus recognized that his actions had shifted the dynamics of power, exposing fractures that could no longer be concealed. In the weeks that followed, journalists published detailed reports on systemic abuse, highlighting Davis's misconduct and protective networks that had allowed it to persist. Public forums debated reform, and community organizations mobilized. Marcus's story became a symbol, proof that courage, evidence, and persistence could challenge entrenched power. Yet the narrative was nuanced. The officer's downfall did not erase the fear Marcus had felt, nor the isolation he had endured. Friends who had whispered in fear slowly reconnected, offering support, but Marcus knew some wounds would remain private, internal, unspoken. Justice had been achieved excellently, but healing was ongoing. He met again with Jamal, this time walking through a quiet neighborhood park. "It's strange," Jamal said. "You won the fight, but the shadow of it doesn't just vanish." Marcus nodded. "No, it's a reminder. Courage doesn't erase fear. Exposure doesn't erase trauma. But it does shift power. That shift, that's something tangible, something the system can't ignore." Later, he drafted a reflection for the advocacy group, documenting the process from the initial incident to public accountability. He detailed the systemic patterns, bureaucratic obstacles, and emotional cost. The document became a guide for others, a blueprint for navigating and challenging abuse of authority. At home, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of quiet. The apartment was still, the city muted. He reviewed the news coverage one last time, clips of the hearing, analysis, commentary. Davis's face appeared, taut with frustration. The diplomatic mask on. Marcus felt a complex mix of satisfaction, exhaustion, and lingering anxiety. He understood that poetic justice had been served. The officer faced consequences for actions once shielded by privilege. Institutional patterns had been exposed. Yet personal costs remained undeniable. The fight for systemic reform continued. But Marcus Harper had proven that courage, strategy, and persistence could pierce the veil of untouchability. As he looked out over the city, Marcus reflected on the journey. Every shove, every dismissal, every threat had been part of a larger narrative, one of systemic bias, abuse of power, and eventual accountability. His resilience, careful documentation, and strategic action had shifted the narrative, ensured exposure, and delivered consequences. But he also knew that healing was ongoing. Sleep would remain restless, vigilance would persist, and memory would occasionally bring the officer's shadow back into sharp focus. Justice had been achieved, but at a cost measured in emotional endurance, personal sacrifice, and a persistent reminder that systemic power protects itself first. Marcus Harper exhaled deeply, letting the night air settle over him. The city had witnessed accountability. The untouchable had been exposed. And those scars remained, so did resilience. The cost was high, but the balance of power had shifted, proving that even the most protected masks could be broken when courage, evidence, and persistence converged. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting stripes of light across Marcus Harper's apartment. He moved slowly, a stiffness lingering in his shoulders, a reminder of the months of tension, vigilance, and fear. The city outside continued its rhythm. Sirens, horns, footsteps, but Marcus felt a subtle shift. The streets no longer seemed like a trap. They were spaces he reclaimed, cautiously, deliberately. He sat at the kitchen table, coffee steaming beside him, and reviewed the documents he had compiled over the ordeal. Complaints, evidence, media coverage, legal briefs, all a record of resistance against entrenched authority. Each page told a story of courage, strategy, and the cost of confronting power. His hand lingered on the video stills from that night. The shove, the officer's smirk, the emblem. Those images had been both a wound and a weapon. Jamal arrived shortly after, carrying a bag of pastries. "You look like a man who hasn't slept in weeks," he said, setting the bag down. Marcus managed a small, tight smile, more like a man who can finally breathe without looking over his shoulder. They went over the next steps: community outreach, advocacy initiatives, and ongoing monitoring of policy reforms. Marcus realized that justice was not a finite event, but a process. The officer's suspension and scrutiny were milestones, not endpoints. The real work was systemic, ensuring that no one else could be rendered powerless while the shield of authority protected the abuser. A call came from Lila Moreno. "Marcus, the piece is live," she said. "Your story is reaching thousands. People are sharing it, analyzing it. Some are even contacting local officials, demanding accountability." Marcus felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Public attention was a double-edged sword, empowering, but also exposing to scrutiny and, potentially, retaliation. He spent the afternoon meeting with community leaders, discussing workshops, awareness campaigns, and support networks. Dialogue was intentional, measured, but also raw. "It's about creating structures," one leader said, "so power cannot operate unchecked. Your fight showed us what happens when courage meets bureaucracy, and what happens when people stay silent." Evening fell, and Marcus walked through the city streets, retracing familiar routes. The same stretch where the stop had occurred felt different now. The fear that had once gripped him had not vanished entirely, but had transformed into vigilance, awareness, and determination. He noticed subtle gestures, a bystander holding a door for someone, a driver slowing to allow a pedestrian, small affirmations of shared humanity amidst a landscape of authority and control. At home, Marcus reflected on personal costs, strained friendships, sleepless nights, lingering anxiety. Yet he also recognized resilience he had not acknowledged before. Each confrontation, each document submitted, each careful strategy had honed a sharper understanding of institutional dynamics and human behavior. He had been forced to navigate betrayal, fear, and the mechanics of power, and survived. He reached for his phone, sending a brief message to Elaine. "We need a follow-up strategy meeting. The public response is growing. We can leverage it for real systemic change." The response was immediate. Acknowledgement, plan for next steps, reinforcement of the strategic approach. Collaboration, Marcus realized, was essential. The fight against abuse could not rest on one person. Later, he drafted a personal reflection, not for publication, but for himself. Words flowed about fear, anger, resilience, and the delicate balance of justice and accountability. He acknowledged the scars, emotional, psychological, but also the knowledge that his experience could guide others. Each documented injustice, each strategic intervention, each alliance formed was a tool to empower those rendered voiceless. Night settled over the city. Marcus sat on the balcony, listening to the distant hum of traffic, the faint echo of sirens, the murmur of neighborhoods winding down. The emblem of authority, once a symbol of untouchable power, no longer loomed as a threat. It had been exposed, constrained, and challenged. He felt the weight of his actions, the ripple effect on the community, and a fragile hope that real change was possible. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, letting the tension of months slowly release. Healing would not be immediate, but awareness, strategy, and resilience had created space for recovery. He understood that accountability was a continuous effort, but the foundations had been laid. The officer's fall was not just personal. It was emblematic, a cautionary tale of power exposed and challenged. Before turning in, Marcus looked at the city skyline, the lights like pinpricks in darkness. Each light represented life, movement, and observation. He realized that vigilance was ongoing, that resistance could take many forms, and that change, while slow and imperfect, was tangible. He had confronted the untouchable, survived the system's inertia, and reclaimed agency over his life. In that quiet moment, Marcus Harper understood the full weight of consequence and cost, but also the meaning of resilience. He was scarred, cautious, aware, but not defeated. The city, the system, and the structures of power had been challenged, and though vigilance must continue, he had become a model of strategic resistance, a testament to courage meeting bureaucracy and surviving. The morning light streamed through Marcus Harper's apartment windows, painting the walls with clarity that mirrored his thoughts. Months had passed since the confrontation, and life had settled into a tense rhythm. Yet, beneath the surface calm, Marcus remained acutely aware. Change was fragile, and vigilance was perpetual. He began his day reviewing recent developments. The officer had been formally charged with misconduct, his suspension extended indefinitely pending a full internal review. Community organizations had mobilized, inspired by Marcus's courage and the meticulous documentation he had provided. The story had become more than a singular event. It was now a blueprint for accountability, a case study in exposing institutional failures and demanding justice. A knock at the door interrupted his concentration. It was Jamal, carrying a stack of printed materials. "Updates from the Advocacy Network," he said. "They're organizing workshops, legal clinics, and public awareness campaigns. Your case is the model they're using." Marcus nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and caution. The work was multiplying, reaching further than he had anticipated, and that reach carried both opportunity and risk. Marcus spent the morning on calls and video conferences with leaders of local organizations, strategizing ways to maintain momentum without sacrificing personal safety. They discussed community surveillance programs, citizen reporting systems, and workshops on understanding rights during police interactions. Marcus emphasized documentation and evidence, stressing that institutional accountability required meticulous records and clear chains of responsibility. In the afternoon, he visited a local community center where a seminar was being held in his honor. The room was filled with young adults, community leaders, and law enforcement officials willing to engage in dialogue. Marcus spoke plainly. This isn't about revenge or spectacle. It's about systems that fail people and how ordinary citizens can ensure they don't remain invisible in the eyes of authority. Questions followed, sharp, probing, and sometimes skeptical. Marcus answered with precision, citing his experience, the legal framework, and practical steps for ensuring transparency. He emphasized that courage alone was insufficient. Strategy, collaboration, and preparation were critical. The audience absorbed his words, some visibly shaken, others invigorated with determination. Walking back home through the city streets, Marcus observed the subtle changes around him. Officers moved with more awareness. Civilians engaged in conversation about rights and responsibilities, and community members organized neighborhood watches. The small acts of vigilance and solidarity were tangible, evidence that the landscape of authority was shifting, however incrementally. At his apartment, Marcus reflected on personal evolution. The ordeal had transformed him, reshaping perceptions of risk, authority, and power. He had learned that confrontation could be strategic, that fear could be harnessed into awareness, and that documentation could wield influence where rhetoric alone faltered. These lessons, hard-earned, were now tools to guide others. That evening, he drafted a formal guide, navigating authority and ensuring accountability. It included practical instructions for citizens, how to record interactions, legal rights, escalation procedures, and community advocacy methods. Marcus intended the guide to serve as a blueprint, a resource for anyone facing systemic abuse or institutional neglect. It was precise, unemotional, and designed for maximum clarity, stripped of sentiment but dense with actionable knowledge. The city outside hummed with routine activity, yet Marcus felt a quiet vigilance in the air. Surveillance cameras, bystanders, and engaged community members formed a subtle network of observation and accountability. The once overwhelming symbols of unchecked authority, the badge, the emblem, the uniform, had been tempered by visibility, transparency, and collective awareness. Marcus understood that the struggle for systemic change required constant attention, careful monitoring, and relentless follow-through. He called Lila Moreno, coordinating a follow-up story. The narrative must focus on long-term systemic changes, not just the officer's misconduct, he said. People need to understand that accountability is ongoing, not episodic. Lila agreed, noting the public interest in sustained reform. Marcus realized that the media could amplify reform but also distort reality. Careful guidance was essential. Late night found Marcus on the balcony, looking out over the city skyline. The lights were innumerable, each a life, a witness, a node in the network of vigilance he had helped activate. The fear that once gripped him had not disappeared but had been reframed. It was now a tool, a reminder that attention, preparation, and awareness were necessary to prevent abuses of power from occurring. He reflected on personal costs, relationships strained, trust tested, moments of deep anxiety, but also on gains, clarity, resilience, and influence. Marcus recognized that legacy was built not merely on personal courage, but on the structures and systems one could affect. His experience had become a catalyst, turning isolated courage into collective empowerment. Before sleep, Marcus reviewed the final points of his guide, ensuring clarity and precision. He knew that vigilance was not optional. It was a continuous obligation. Systems evolve, individuals change roles, and authority adapts. But the principles of accountability, documentation, and collaboration were immutable tools for maintaining justice. As he turned off the lights, Marcus felt a steady resolve. The officer's fall had been significant, but the broader mission, ensuring institutional responsibility and empowering citizens, was far from complete. He had transformed fear into action, isolation into collaboration, and risk into knowledge. Marcus Harper had become a living testament. Courage paired with strategy could confront entrenched power, and the resulting legacy could extend beyond one incident, shaping awareness and vigilance for the future. The city slept, but its consciousness had shifted. Marcus understood that change required persistence, precision, and presence. He had laid foundations, ignited movements, and modeled resilience. Vigilance would never cease, but he had demonstrated that one individual, armed with knowledge and strategy, could catalyze systemic accountability, turning personal experience into a communal legacy of empowerment and justice.